All right, welcome. This is note 7.1, the first try, the first part of it anyway, first day, slides 1 through 13. And this is Versailles to Pearl Harbor. We're rewinding a little bit. We talked about the New Deal, the Great Depression and the New Deal and Roosevelt. And we're going back to sort of the beginning of the Great Depression, a few years after the Treaty of Versailles, and we're going to work our way forward through American foreign policy and what's going on in other parts of the world to the beginnings of World War II and then eventually to Pearl Harbor. So that's the plan. Let's take a look. That story is a classroom special. You had to have been there. I mean, you can pause and go back and read it, but the performance, that was a classroom-only thing. So Benito Mussolini, not that World War II is Benito Mussolini's fault, not that he's the only one that did anything, but it does, a lot of the things that sort of set into motion during this time period come from Benito Mussolini in a lot of ways. And this photograph is him giving a big speech at the Colosseum in Rome. That Colosseum, like the giant Colosseum from the Roman Empire, like a couple thousand years ago. And it's obviously still around, maybe some of you have visited. But he gave a bunch of his speeches, held a bunch of his rallies there. And that's just one photograph of him doing it. So, fascism in Italy. Italy's going through a lot of the same problems that America went through during the Great Depression. There's no jobs, there's no money, and there's not enough food. So they have some problems to solve. And the king isn't really up to solving the problems, much like Herbert Hoover wasn't really up to solving the problems in America. And two political forces sort of rise up trying to take over Italy from this point forward. You have the Italian Communist Party, who believes that the Depression here is proof that capitalism has failed, and communism would fix everything, and communism would get people jobs and food and shelter again, which sounded really good to a lot of Italians. Now, would it have worked? Hard to say. Communism, at least that type of communism, hasn't had a very good track record in that part of Europe or during that time period in history. It's possible, but certainly not going to try and argue that the communists were the good guys or the people that should have won. This is just the thing that happened, right? And the other group that rose up and tried to grab power and ultimately succeeded in grabbing power was the Italian Fascist Party. And I'm not calling them fascists because I disagree with them politically, therefore you're a fascist. They called themselves fascists. That was their political philosophy, fascism. And we'll talk about communism as we get to it, but the basic political philosophy of fascism, and if you want a really in-depth rundown, go check out, Umberto Eco's essay from 1995 about what fascism is. It's a wonderful article. That'll give you the in-depth discussion. The basics of fascist political philosophy is we deserve power and everybody else exists to serve us. Now that us and that we, that differs from group to group, from fascist organization to fascist organization. In Italy, it was sort of that idea of the Roman Empire. We Romans, we Italians, we deserve to conquer the world and everyone else exists to serve our empire. In Germany, of course, German fascism, it was, of course, the Aryan, that sort of mythical idea of the Aryans. Most of the German Nazi ideals of the Aryans had nothing to do with the actual historical Aryans, but that didn't stop, the fascists from sort of, grabbing onto that identity. And, of course, in American fascism, that in-group were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASPs. Now, fortunately, American fascists don't come into power, but there certainly was an American fascist organization and movement, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But so there's a communist party going on. There's this rise of this fascist group led by Benito Mussolini. Things are bad in Italy after World War II and the Depression. And a lot of people are unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. It didn't hit Italy the same way it did Germany, but it definitely hit Italy as well. And people were ready to get rid of it. And Mussolini was the person who said that, hey, we'll do this. If you put the nationalists, if you put the fascists into power, we will become powerful enough we can get rid of the Treaty of Versailles. And things get pretty bad. There's a lot of conflict, open conflict in the streets, like street gangs, militias, paramilitary groups fighting in the streets, communists and fascists. So you'd have a fascist rally going on, and the communists would show up and start a fight. And you'd have a communist rally going on, a few days from then, and then the fascists would show up and start a fight. Just as brawls in the streets. People are getting hurt, people are dying, and the cities are kind of falling apart into this chaos. The city of Rome is where most of this takes place, but other cities in Italy are kind of having their own versions of it. And the fascists, the Benito Mussolini's people, the fascists on their side, they were the black shirts because they wore black shirts. It's not very creative, but it's what they call themselves. And the king is kind of panicking. The king of Rome is kind of panicking over all this. Things were bad enough with the Great Depression, but now there's just like brawls in the streets. And so the king sort of tries to throw a whole bunch of stuff, whatever at the wall to see what sticks. Rule by the state, by the king is invoked. He takes away people's individual rights, gets rid of the free market, gets rid of capitalism. He's just trying anything he can. And nothing seems to be working. Things are just getting worse and worse and worse. And eventually, the Italian king kind of like gives Mussolini about this much power. Like the king and the government in place have this much power. But Mussolini's got about this much power. And the king gives him that power. And then he takes a bit more. And when that works, he takes all of it. And we end up with Benito Mussolini as the fascist dictator of Italy. Which is bad. So the paradigm question we went over in class was, why did Mussolini choose the old Roman Colosseum as the location to hold his rallies? Very good answers in class, but basically it was a giant, easy to see, easy to understand symbol of the Roman Empire, of the power, of the prestige, of the glory of the Roman Empire. And Mussolini wanted himself seen as that strong of a man, that kind of a person that could bring back the Roman Empire. So what was he like in power? He vows to conquer the world, right? We're going to be the next Roman Empire. And people in Italy were either 100% supportive of him or they were getting thrown in jail. So it was very serious to the Italians. To a lot of people around the world, they thought this was kind of silly. He would wear these military uniforms and go around giving these silly speeches, and they didn't really take him seriously. And a lot of people around the world didn't really take Hitler seriously at first either. So we need to sort of fix our perception on that sort of a thing. Take these kind of people seriously. And his first thing is he's going to get revenge against Ethiopia, because Ethiopia and Italy had a bit of a fight in the late 1800s, and Ethiopia won, which isn't normally what happens when European countries and African countries would fight back then because of the technology, really the weaponry difference. But in this case, Ethiopia basically kicks Italy out. And so Italy's like, you know what, if we're going to be Rome again, we got to conquer northern Africa again, just like Rome did. So that's kind of their plan. He also creates basically his fascist corporate system, which is different from free market capitalism corporations, right? Because in free market capitalism, the corporations and the consumers, the private people, the non-government people, they're in charge of the economy, right? Like we vote with our dollars. They produce based on what we're gonna consume, and there's kind of a relationship there. And the government exists, but it's more of a referee, in free market capitalism, at least, that's the idea. And the in the corporate system here, the fascist government is the corporation. They are in charge of the economy. And yeah, there's still money and jobs, and you buy stuff, but the government is not the referee kind of sitting back and watching. The government is the corporation, the one making the money. Also modernizes the Italian economy, gets the trains running on time. People say that about Hitler a lot, but really it was Mussolini that did that. And created jobs in the military sector, building guns and making ammo and building tanks and stuff, which is super against the Treaty of Versailles, but he didn't care because he didn't like the Treaty of Versailles. Most of the country didn't either. And it's not like England or France was going to invade Italy because they were building some tanks. So he just ignored it. No real consequence for that. And Mussolini is not like the worst dictator that's ever existed. He's not a particularly successful dictator in terms of things. Italy certainly plays a role in World War II, but it's not a very successful role most of the time. And, Mussolini ends up, we'll talk about where he ends up. It's not a pretty place. He doesn't make it through World War II. But his real sort of contribution, and not in a good way, to world history is less his own dictatorship, but rather the path he took to that dictatorship. Hitler and Stalin were able to follow it almost to the letter to gain the power that they did as dictators of Germany and Russia, respectively. So we're going to shift a little bit west. We're going to head over to Guernica. This is a painting by Pablo Picasso about the city of the same name. One of the, maybe the first, modern bombing campaign was taken out during the Spanish Civil War on the city of Guernica by Italy and Germany. We'll talk about why Italy and Germany were involved in the Spanish Civil War in a minute. But this painting by Guernica, by Pablo Picasso, titled Guernica, is sort of like what it felt like to be there when the bombs dropped. The confusion, the fear, the pain, the chaos, the violence, the grief. Everything here is pieces of things. It's not, you don't really see a whole lot of entire people or entire animals or entire things. It all seems to be pieces. And that's very much on purpose. So, why was Spain fighting a civil war? And why were Italy and Germany involved? Well, again, you had a fascist uprising. You had the nationalists, fascists, and their leader, Francisco Franco, was trying to become the dictator of Spain, and they were opposed by the Republicans, not the American Republican Party, but political Republicans. And generally what that means outside of the United States, I mean, it kind of means that in the United States too, honestly, but we're talking about outside the United States for the moment. If you hear about a Republican Party, then generally speaking, they are going to be against having a king or a dictator or an emperor or whatever, and pro-elected representatives, which America has. So we're kind of a republic, kind of a democracy. I mean, most countries aren't all one thing or all the other thing. We're mostly a republic and mostly a democracy. And so this civil war is raging. People are fighting. People are getting killed. And the League of Nations shows up and says, hey, cut that out. And neither side cuts it out. And the League of Nations goes, well, that's all the power I have. And that's it for the League of Nations. And so Francisco Franco calls up some of his fascist buddies in Central Europe, Hitler and Mussolini, and say, hey, can you guys come help me win this civil war, and then we'll have another fascist country in Europe. And Hitler and Mussolini, this is the first time they really team up. This is when that alliance is formed. And they roll in and they help fight against the Republicans, and that's when the bombing of Guernica happens. And the Republicans are kind of desperate at this point, so they're crying out for help from any democratic government, any, free form of government that doesn't want to see more dictators in the world. And they try and appeal to the democracies of Europe, and they say, well, we're part of the League of Nations, and we tried everything we could, and it didn't work. And then they call up the U.S., and they're like, hey, America, could you help us out here? And America goes, oh, we're doing that isolationist thing. We did not like what happened in World War I. We did not like the results and all the American troops that died, so we're just going to stay out of this. I mean, if you want to buy and sell stuff, we'll make some money, do some deals, but we're not getting involved in a war. And so with no help, the Republicans are cast aside, and the nationalists take over, and Francisco Franco becomes the dictator of Spain for quite a long time, long enough for Saturday Night Live to make fun of him. Not like 2020 Saturday Night Live, but the first couple seasons of Saturday Night Live. It was a running joke about Generalissimo Francisco Franco. So we are like in the modern day, that's what I'm saying. So that's Italy and Spain, and now Japan. We'll get to Germany tomorrow. Japan has always been like a second-rate power in the world. They're not nothing. They certainly have a military. They certainly have an economy. But they don't have a ton of natural resources available. They don't have a giant population. They can't really take advantage of what power they do have. And they want to be a major player. You know, they were involved in World War I a little bit. They got to go to the Treaty of Versailles. They got to sort of, you know, see what it was like sitting at the same table, literally, the Treaty of Versailles, but being in the same rooms, being part of the same organizations, being part of the same groups as these massively powerful empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the American Empire. And they want that for themselves. So they study the books. How did America become as powerful as it is? How did Japan want to become powerful? How did England become as powerful as it did? How did France become as powerful as it did? Back in the day, how did Spain and Portugal become as rich and powerful as they did for a while? And the answer they keep coming back to is the same answer American imperialists came to, and that's, you need an empire. You need colonies. Remember the influence of sea power on world history? Japan read it too. And so they came to the same conclusions Teddy Roosevelt came to. You want to be a big imperial power? You need colonies. You want colonies? You need a military and a navy. So Japan starts modernizing their military and their navy. And they invade, as their first colony, Manchuria, which is sort of a province in northeastern China, and kind of look around and see if anyone's going to stop them. Nobody does, so they start conquering south along the east coast of China, and that's just this gigantic chunk taken out of China to become a colony of Japan. And the U.S., who is sort of friends with China at the time, they're like, hey, hold on, stop invading our friend. And Japan's like, oh, no, we're going to keep doing this. Like, you can send an army to try and stop us, but we're going to keep doing this. And America's like, oh, we're not. We're not really. We're doing an isolationism thing right now. And so Japan takes and conquers those parts of China. And the U.S. wasn't really afraid of Japan's army, but they were afraid that if they tried to push things too far, there could be, because Japan was a trading partner, so there could be issues with that. There could be other conflicts that come up, and America's just trying to stay out of it, right? It doesn't have anything to do with them. Japan invading China has nothing to do with America. The Spanish Civil War has nothing to do with America. You know, after how rough World War I was for our soldiers, we just don't want to get involved with stuff like this anymore. Very isolationist. So unfortunately, that does free up, not free up, it's not like we let them do it, but that those conquests that Japan is pulling off in China, there's a lot of, what we would call war crimes in the modern day. Now, if we look back at the American expansion into the West, there were certainly war crimes against the natives. If we take a look at what the British did in their empire, certainly things that would qualify as war crimes. But I'm not trying to say that to let Japan off the hook. I'm just saying that because we need to take an honest look at our own history and not look at Japan and go, they were terrible. They were terrible. But we got to look in the mirror sometime too. So obviously, Japan should not have committed these war crimes. Obviously, countries that do commit war crimes like this, including the times that our country has and our allies have, as well as our not so allied countries in the world, they need to, there needs to be the truth needs to be told about it, at the very least. beyond that, I mean, that's for other folks other than me to decide, but as someone who's interested in history, definitely need to tell the truth. And this slide calls this a battle. It wasn't really a battle, it was a massacre. The Japanese army rolled into town, destroyed the town, killed a bunch of people, took a bunch of women as slaves. And that's one of the reasons this is called the Rape of Nanking. One of the major war crimes that the Japanese military committed here was raping a lot of these women that they took hostage. And to this day, the Japanese government would deny that. And they would say instead that these Chinese women had been, I don't know, the phrase that gets used a lot is comfort women, which is real bad. Because the Chinese women didn't choose to do this. They weren't there on purpose. They weren't trying to comfort the Japanese soldiers. They were victims of war crimes. And that's the other reason it's called the Rape of Nanking. So at the end of the day, we took a vote here in class, at the end of each class period. Should America have gotten involved in these conflicts in Spain and China? Should we have stayed isolated, or should we have gotten involved? So on the scale of 1 to 10, a 1, meaning that we need to stay isolated, don't get involved, all the way to 10. So 1 is like, do what we did. Don't get involved, stay isolated, stay out of it. What we did back then was correct. That's a 1. A 10 is we should have gotten our army in the field to defend democracy in Spain and defend our ally China when it was invaded by Japan. And had a few 8s and 9s. I think I had a 10 in one of the classes from one student. But for the most part, 5s and 6s seemed to be the highest a lot of people were willing to go. And there were a lot of 3s and 4s, a few 2s, a couple of 1s. And overall, the average score for each class was, for the most part, below 5. Some, in the 3.5 range. So that's not a right or a wrong answer. That's just, in a democracy, we all have to figure out what we're going to do, right? In a democracy, you can do whatever you want if you can get enough people to back you on it. And so, as for those of you that are in high school, not 18 yet, you're going to be 18 pretty soon, which means you're going to be able to vote probably in the 2022 elections, definitely in the 2024 elections. So, how should we treat our allies? How should we treat people outside of our country? Politicians have opinions on that. They have strongly held principles and beliefs about this sort of thing. So that should be something you consider when you decide who you're going to vote for. And that's it for the day. So we're going to go ahead and take on off. Goodbye. The end. Stop recording.